Welcome back to Introduction to Jewish Philosophy. What is classic rabbinical thought, and who needs it all together? In our first installment, we focused both at the beginning and at the end on the subject of definitions. That's why we began with the quest for a rigorous definition of philosophy and focused at length on the definition of philosophy as the investigation of causes and laws underlying reality, with the realization that, on the one hand, general philosophy is indeed that process whereby we impose upon a set of givens, a system, a methodology, a structure, and that's the philosophy. And all thinking human beings essentially are engaged in doing that. And moved on from there to consider the application to Jewish philosophy. Jewish philosophy is also the investigation of causes and laws underlying reality. Just the definition of reality includes an additional given, the Torah, which is given. And it was in light of that realization that we considered definition 10, the system of values by which one lives, and the problem that if the Torah is already telling you how to live, then where is there any room for philosophy? So we began our foray into answering this question by considering at least a couple of domains in which manifestly the Torah is not telling you merely what to do, but in essence is summoning you to consider something, if you will, broader, more holistic, that will ultimately inform what you do. It'll be the system of values by which one lives. And we focused on that last time, in particular, in considering the opening verse of the Torah, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and in particular, the extent to which it does have, down the road, practical ramifications, in particular, in Rashi's interpretation, but that doesn't change the fact that the verse itself is enunciating something conceptual that isn't in any way practical. In much the same vein, we considered as well the list of mitzvot tmidiyot, of perpetual mitzvot in Sefer HaChinuch, with the realization that at least the first 5, possibly the whole 6, but certainly the first 5, entail some kind of theological, philosophical understanding in order to fulfill them. Believing in God, not believing in anything else, the unification of God, loving God, revering God, definitely. Concepts that require elucidation in order to fulfill them. And of course, that brought us back to the realm of definitions, with the realization that in order to be able to meaningfully speak about anything, you need to understand what it is that you're talking about. And of course, it was in that vein that we discussed what Rambam warns in the beginning of Unit 1, Chapter 50 of the Guide, that belief is not the notion that is uttered, but the notion that is represented in the soul, when it has been averred of it that it is in fact just as it has been represented. If you don't know what you're talking about, you're not even on the page. So again, this need for rigorous definitions is something that we noted at the beginning and end of our last session. It had implications with respect to the manner in which Ramban concluded with the final tour de force, the Barcelona disputation in 1263. Again, all of this is what we discussed last time. We need to move on and consider on a broader plane just what we do have to say with respect to the implications of what the Torah tells us beyond actual practice. To that extent, we focus presently on what amounts to one single crucial word that recurs several times in the Torah, that word being leman. In particular, We're going to focus our attention at present on 3 instances in which we encounter this term in the Torah. The first being what we read in Parashat Bo with respect to the mitzvah of tefillin, L'ma'an tihyeh Torat Hashem beficha, that the Torah of God be in your mouth, ki biyad chazaka hosiacha Hashem mitzrayim, because by mighty hand God brought you forth from Egypt. The second instance upon which we focus presently is in Parashat Emor, where we read about the mitzvah of Sukkah. And after instructing us, Basukot Teshvu Shivat Yamim, that we are to dwell in Sukkot for 7 days, the Torah continues, L'ma'an, in order that. L'ma'an yed'u dorotechem ki basukot shavti et bnei Yisrael b'hotziotam eretz Mitzrayim. That your generations will know that I caused the people of Israel to dwell in Sukkot when I brought them forth from the land of Egypt. And third, in Parashat Shelach, where we read of the mitzvah of tzitzit, and once again there's a L'ma'an. L'ma'an tizkiru va'asitem et kol mitzvotai v'hitem kedoshim le'elokechem. That you will remember and do all of my mitzvot and be holy to your God. We focus upon these 3 examples because they are implicitly relevant to our understanding an apparent digression from a strict halachic narrative in one of the most important tracts of halacha, the Arba'at Turim, written by Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher. We're talking about a major medieval sage who lived from 1269 to 1343, and his Arba'at Turim serves as the template for the Shulchan Aruch that was subsequently composed by Rav Yosef Karo. And while it's entirely a halachic code, there are 3 places where Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher launches into a seeming philosophical digression, telling us what the implications of the mitzvah are in terms of our intention. In the chronology of our daily and ultimately yearly program, the first is in the laws of tzitzit, where he bids a person bear in mind in wrapping himself in the tzitzit, kedei shenizkor kol mitzvotav la'asotam, to remember all of God's commandments, to do them. In a similar vein, we encounter in the laws of tefillin, likewise, v'yechaven b'hanachatam shetzivanu hamakom lahaniach arba parshiot elu, that we are to intend in our laying the tefillin that God commanded us to place these 4 passages, kedei shenizkor yitziat mitzrayim eidei nisim v'niflaot she'asa imanu, to remember the Exodus from Egypt and all of the attendant miracles that took place in its context, shem morim al yichudo, because they serve as indicators of God's unity, shu yachid be'olamo v'asher lo kofem amshal be'elyonim v'atachtonim lo tzobim kirtzono, to appreciate that God is unique in the world and has the exclusive capacity in the heavenly and terrestrial realms to do as he wills. And the third place is in the laws of Sukkah, where once again we have this seeming digression from a halachic discussion in telling us that the Sukkah is to instruct us regarding the verity of the existence of the Creator, and to believe that he created everything according to his will, and that he has the capacity and sovereignty and wherewithal in the heavenly and terrestrial realms to do as he wills. And the Sukkah is a reminder of that, of the wonders and awesome acts that God has wrought. And inevitably the question, why the digression from strict halakha? And the answer supplied by Rabbi Yoel Sirkish, the Bach, Beit Chadash, lives from 1561 to 1640, and is one of the principal commentators on the Arba Turim, that what sets apart these three mitzvot is the extent to which having something in mind is intrinsic to the commandment, because the Torah says leman. And if one doesn't have the intention to fulfill that mandate as enunciated in the Torah itself, then there's something lacking in the way one has fulfilled the mitzvah. With respect to tzitzit, Rabbi Yossi Sirkish expresses it that ikar ha-mitzvah v'kiyuma tluya bechavanata, that the essence of the mitzvah and its fulfillment depends upon the intention. In his expounding on the mitzvah of Sukkah and the Torah's apparent digression out of the realm of strict halakha, he uses a formulation that I must admit it's kind of difficult for me to pin down rigorously, and that is, if you don't have the intention, lo kiyem ha-mitzvah ketikuna. Such a person has not fulfilled the mitzvah in the proper manner. Something's missing. Because the Torah itself tells you, it's not simply about what you do, it's also about what you intend. Lima'an, for the sake of. What's the goal for which the practical fulfillment of the mitzvah is necessarily directed? Now, of course, you might say, well, these are just three extraordinary exceptions to a rule in which you really don't have to think about anything other than just doing the mitzvah itself. Not so fast. These are actually not the only three places where we encounter lima'an in the Torah. The Tur, however, can be readily excused for his not explicitly mentioning any of the others. Let's recount the others, at least briefly. The next instance that we'll note, just in terms of the chronology of the mitzvot, is what we read in Parashat Re'eh, this is Deuteronomy chapter 14, regarding the second tithe. The second tithe is to be brought to Yerushalayim and eaten in consecrated space, and there is a particular lima'an, imperative, associated with the act of eating the second tithe in Jerusalem, lima'an tilma lir'a et Hashem Elokecha kol hayamim, that you will learn to revere God your Lord all the days. In other words, again, there's something you need to bear in mind. And of course, the laws of the second tithe don't appear anywhere in the Torah because it's not a mitzvah that can be actualized in the state of exile, which is the context in which the Torah was writing and the context of all of the mitzvot that the Torah explicates in his halachic composition. For the same reason, the next example, which also appears in Parashat Re'eh, in Deuteronomy chapter 16, is also not to be found in the Torah. It is indeed the Paschal offering. That is, with respect to the Paschal offering, we read explicitly, "Leman tizkor yom tzeitka me'eretz Mitzrayim kol yemei chayecha." You are to bring it and fulfill this mitzvah in order to remember the day of your exodus from the land of Egypt all the days of your life. Again, a leman. The next example, in Parashat Shoftim, Deuteronomy chapter 17, is also a mitzvah that won't appear in the Torah. It certainly isn't something that can be practiced by anyone nowadays. It is a law that pertains specifically and exclusively to the king, who is commanded to write a copy of the Torah that accompanies him everywhere. Why? למען ילמד ליראת השם אלוקיו לשמור את כל דברי התורה הזאת ואת החוקים האלה לעשותם. In order to learn to revere God his Lord, to keep all of the words of this Torah and these statutes, to do them. And finally, the last instance in which we read an explicit Lama'an, which also isn't going to appear in the Tur, pertains to the mitzvah of Hakhel, the Sukkot following the sabbatical year. Everyone is to gather together in the place that God chooses to hear the reading of the Torah by the king. L'ma'an yishme'u, l'ma'an yilmedu v'yar'u et Hashem Elokeichem, in order that they hear and learn and revere God your Lord. Again, something that needs to be borne in mind in the fulfillment of a mitzvah. Now, granted, these are all specific mitzvot, but the truth of the matter is, I left the tour de force for last. And that is the Lima'an that appears, we can see it on the screen in front of us right now, in Parashat Ve'etchanan. It's important to stress this point. It's the beginning of Deuteronomy chapter 6. To what mitzvah is this Lima'an referring? We read in verse 1, this is the mitzvah, the statutes and the ordinances that God, your Lord, commanded to teach you to do in the land into which you are passing to possess it. Lima'an, in order that you will revere God, your Lord, to keep all of his statutes and commandments which I am commanding you, your child, and your child's child, all of the days of your life, and that your life be prolonged. This Lima'an is extraordinarily expansive because it pertains to all of the mitzvot. In verse 1, it is the full compendium of all mitzvot that is referenced, and it is with respect to all of them that there is this imperative of Lima'an, that you will revere God your Lord, to keep all of his statutes and commandments that I command you. You know, I must add here, with respect to this final Lima'an, there is a well-known Talmudic discussion. It appears in a number of instances in the Talmud, starting at the beginning of the second chapter of Tractate Brachot, but also in Tractate Eruvin, Tractate Pesachim, and Tractate Rosh Hashanah, the question of whether mitzvot tzrichot kavanah, whether in order to fulfill one's obligation, one needs to have intention to fulfilling a mitzvah. Now, it's of critical importance that we appreciate that we aren't speaking of any kind of highfalutin conceptual intentions in the fulfillment of a mitzvah here. We're speaking on the most rudimentary plane of being cognizant that what one is doing is in fact fulfillment of the mitzvah. But it's important for us to appreciate that this may indeed be intrinsic to proper fulfillment of the mitzvah. Admittedly, it emerges in the Talmud that this is a point of dissension, but precisely because it's an unresolved dissension, we posit axiomatically in halakha that when one is fulfilling a Torah-ordained commandment, if one does not have intention to be fulfilling a mitzvah, one should fulfill the commandment again, because fulfillment without that minimal intention of fulfilling God's command may be of no avail. The classic illustration of the dispute, which is indeed the subject of the appearance of this discussion in Tractate Rosh Hashanah, is Tokea Lashir. If you wake up one bright sunny morning and feel the urge to hear a peppy tune and reach for the nearest musical instrument and pipe out that peppy tune. Well, if it turns out that that bright sunny morning just so happened to be Rosh Hashanah, and the nearest musical instrument just so happened to be a kosher shofar, and the peppy tune that you piped out just so happened to be kosher tkiyot and tu'ot, the procedure that is requisite in fulfilling the mitzvah of shofar, but you had no cognizance of a mitzvah of shofar, you were tokei al ashir. You were simply piping out the tune for the sake of music. So under such circumstances, if indeed mitzvot require intention, you haven't fulfilled your obligation because you had no intention to fulfill mitzvah. If mitzvot don't require intention, then even under such circumstances you fulfilled the mitzvah. But if we ask ourselves, what scripturally serves as the undergirding of this discussion? I must admit, I haven't seen anyone who states this explicitly, but I'd like to propose that perhaps is the verses that we just saw in Parashat Ve'etchanan. That is, if the Torah tells you explicitly that all of the mitzvot are L'man tirat Hashem Elokecha lishmo et kol chukotav u'mitzvotav asher anochi mitzavecha, that all of the mitzvot are in order to revere God your Lord, to keep all of His statutes and ordinances that I am commanding you. You've got to know that you're fulfilling a divine statute or ordinance. You're doing a mitzvah. I'm of course emphasizing this point because that places the question of merely going through the motions without that conceptual undergirding on a far, far broader plane than merely exceptional mitzvot that speak of Laman. Indeed, to the extent that there is this position of mitzvot tzrichot kavanah, the intention of be fulfilling a mitzvah, is not merely engaging in some mindless practice. And that may well be intrinsic in the fulfillment of the mitzvah. To place this in more profoundly conceptual terms, it is indeed in a prime piece of real estate in Rambam's Moreh HaNevuchim, Guide of the Perplexed, the first of the 4 concluding chapters that Rambam introduces at the conclusion of the guide, that Rambam gives us a rather stern, perhaps even terrifying warning. Reading what we see on the screen in the English Pines translation, as for someone who thinks and frequently mentions God without knowledge, following a mere imagining or following a belief adopted because of his reliance on the authority of someone else. He, to my mind, does not in true reality mention or think about God at all. For that thing which is in his imagination and which he mentions in his speech does not correspond to any being at all, and has merely been invented by his imagination. You need to conceive of what you're doing and not merely go ahead and do it. And we should appreciate that Rambam grounds this warning in the charge that King David gives to his son Solomon in his last will and testament. When he states, as we read in the first book of Chronicles, in chapter 28, Ve'ata Shlomo v'nei da et Elokei avicha ve'ovdehu. Note the order. You, Solomon my son, know the God of your father and serve him. If there isn't that knowledge as an antecedent to serving him, then something is fundamentally flawed in that service. That essentially is what Rambam is stating. It's not necessarily the only way of understanding the verse. I'll just note in passing that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi expounds the verse somewhat differently, also at the end of his philosophical magnum opus. in Sefer HaKuzari. That's a discussion for elsewhere. But what certainly is relevant in our appreciating this point here is merely going through the motions without recognizing that there needs to be something more that will inform our understanding of our way of life. Just won't cut it. So of course, this is definitely relevant in our appreciating what the underlying need for Jewish philosophy is. Except you could rightly note that all of the examples we've discussed heretofore are not really adequate. We've discussed thus far the opening verse of the Torah. We've discussed the perpetual mitzvot of the Torah. And in our last consideration here, we've discussed the lima'ans in the Torah. Those places where the Torah explicitly speaks of in order that and mandates some kind of conceptual undergirding of what it is that we're doing. Yeah, but you'll recall, we stated at the outset that the philosophy is not the givens. It's the investigation of the laws and causes that underlie reality, not the reality. What you actually see isn't the philosophy. What you actually see is the data, the givens. The philosophy is something that you impose upon the data in order to systematize it, subject it to a methodology, and structure it. It's not simply the data itself. Everything we've discussed thus far is actually in the Torah, which inevitably forces us to confront the question, so who needs philosophy? We've already addressed that question in terms of general philosophy. When we said, who needs philosophy? Well, any thinking human being needs philosophy. Because if all we have is disorganized data, abject confusion, you don't understand anything. And your subjection of that data to some enterprise of systematization, of methodological understanding, of structuring it, that's philosophy. Well, if we ask the question now with respect to Jewish philosophy, remember that's always the second component in each discussion, who needs Jewish philosophy? Transparently, the first answer to this question is, well, aren't Jews thinking human beings? We certainly hope they are. So if every thinking human being necessarily does philosophy in operating on the reality that provides him with a set of givens, any thinking Jewish human being is going to do that with the reality that underlies his set of givens. Just his set of givens is not just the reality that everyone else recognizes as the set of givens, but also the unique set of givens that pertains to Judaism, as we've noted, the Torah, which is given. So, of course, to that extent, it is almost a pedestrian corollary to conclude from the fact that every thinking human being needs philosophy, that every thinking Jewish human being needs Jewish philosophy, which is certainly true, but from my perspective, not at all adequate. I'm going to append to this two additional considerations before we proceed next time with the more detailed illustrations that pertain to our quest for Jewish philosophy. First, an older rabbi whom I know, who lives in Jerusalem, I recall, confided in me a number of years ago that he has this practice of inviting yeshiva students to his Shabbat table Friday night. He lives in a neighborhood with a lot of yeshivot, and at some time during the meal, he springs upon them. So, tell me, why are you religious? In order to watch them squirm. Ouch. In general, they don't have a clue. Should we be disturbed by that? I think we should be profoundly disturbed. That people who sincerely are dedicating themselves to study the Torah 24/7 don't have an answer to the question of why they're religious. They are indeed engaging in Judaism. But what about that underlying understanding? Maybe an apt analogy, in order to drive this point home well, is the actual halachot, what we need to do. We can liken to bricks. So the gamut of the mitzvot are mounds and mounds of bricks. But mounds and mounds of bricks don't give you a place to live. What else do you need? You need some set of plans, blueprints, to tell you where to insert all of those bricks. Now, the blueprints also don't give you a place to live. And even when you try to start translating those blueprints into a physical reality, you set up the scaffolding, the basic structure of the building, you still don't have a place to live. And moreover, any idle breeze that comes along can knock it all down. What you need to do is take that set of blueprints, establish the plans, and start inserting bricks. You only have a home when you have placed every single one of those bricks into the structure. Mind you, if you're missing any bricks, it's not the set of givens of Judaism. And if you have a plan that calls for inclusion of only some of those bricks, even most of those bricks, even all but one of those bricks, as you already know, the home that you build will not be a Jewish home, because it's not a Jewish philosophy, because you aren't addressing all of the givens of Judaism. If the plan says there are bricks that we just leave outside, it's not a Jewish philosophy. But still and all, it's important for us to appreciate, in order to have a place to live in this vein, conceptually, you need the bricks and you need the plan. You cannot manage with just one or the other. And that, most essentially, is why you need a Jewish philosophy. It's the only way those yeshiva students are going to be able to respond to the question of, why are you religious? It's the only way we're going to be able to justify the way of life that we have adopted for ourselves and strive to inculcate in our children. We aren't going to be able to manage only with a user's manual that tells us what to do, without placing it in the conceptual framework of how we understand the way it all comes together, what it all means. Does that imply there's only going to be one answer to that question? Well, you could already imagine what the answer to that question is going to be, but we'll address that later on. For now, we at least have some kind of working prelude to the answer of who needs Jewish philosophy. And it's on that note that we'll continue with some other crucial illustrations of this principle in our next episode.